So it's time to start the seminar. For some people still coming to here, but we should start this seminar. Thank you very much for coming today for this special seminar, Social Science in AI, Challenges and Controversies. I'm Yoshikazu Shiobara, a professor of sociology and a member of the Graduate School of Human Relations in Keio University in Tokyo. I'm a chair of this lecture. Sorry, maybe still people coming, so I have to manage. Okay, now we have 147 audiences here. Yes, so before starting the conference, I would like to ask the audiences to keep your video off during the lectures. Also, please mute your sound, your voices during the lecture. And after the lecture, we have question time. So please feel free to open your video and unmute your voices and to make a question. Okay, all right. Okay, and yes, this is a seminar titled "Social Sciences since AI," and this seminar, this lecture is co-hosted both the JSD Doctoral program of the Graduate School of Human Relations, Keio University, and Jean Monnet Network on Cooperative, Connected and Automated Mobility and Australasian Innovations, University of South Australia. I would like to express our deepest gratitude to both organizations for providing such a great opportunity. People are still coming. And today we have two lectures. Each lecture will be for 40 minutes. And after finishing one lecture, we will provide you 20 minutes discussion and question times. So maybe people is still coming, so maybe, but we have to start the session. Okay, so I would like to proudly introduce you the first lecture today, Professor Anthony Elliott. He's the Dean of External Engagement at the University of South Australia, where he's research professor of sociology and the executive director of the Jean Monnet Center of Excellence and Network. And he's also the super global professor in our department in Keio. And of course, and he's a famous and important social theorist today. And he has a lot of publications, including his latest work titled Making Sense of AI. So, Professor Elliott, please start your lecture.
Well, thank you very much. Minasan konnichiwa. I hope everyone can hear me. And sumimasen. I wish I had more words that I could say in Japanese. I've been visiting Japan now for many years, and I guess my only defense today is that I'm visiting via Zoom. So maybe that's my defense. But thank you very much for listening to my talk today in English. At the outset, I would very much like to thank Professor Shiobara for that kind introduction, and also just to express my thanks to him for the great help that he's given me alongside colleagues at Keio's Graduate School of Human Relations in terms of the Super Global program. It's a great honor for me to visit. I remember well when I used to visit quite often, and we're all hoping that that will be possible again in the near future. I would also just like to note that and it's hugely just personally exciting for me to have the opportunity to speak at this event today. It's quite some time ago that I was a graduate student at Cambridge University in the UK. I was working away on my thesis, the topic of which was critical theory and psychoanalysis. And I remember the excitement when I came across this particular work by this European professor on time. And I was very captivated by this work. I remember telling some of my friends about this work. And that was a work by Professor Helga Nowotny. Little did I think that some time later that we would both be talking on this panel via Zoom to Japan about artificial intelligence. But as I'll be suggesting to you in today's talk, it is a world of surprises. The other thing, just right at the outset, I'd just like to express a few notes of thanks. The team that I work with here at University of South Australia's Jean Monnet Centre of Excellence. We learn a great deal from our interaction with colleagues in Japan. And I think it's certainly the case that we couldn't have achieved what we've been able to do without that input and that support and that guidance. So just I'd like to note in particular the assistance and support of Professor Masataka Katagiri from Rissho University, Professor Atsushi Sawai from Keio University, Professor Hideki Endo from Ritsumeikan University, Dr. Rina Yamamoto from Seijo University, and Professor Takeshi Deguchi from Todai. Thank you all. So I was trying to think of a term that best encapsulates what it's like to live in a world of thoroughgoing artificial intelligence. And the term that I've come up with, for better or for worse, is that of technological tsunami. A technological tsunami, ladies and gentlemen, by which I'm referring to the growing, gradual realization that more women and men have today, I think, that their core sense of selves, their sense of their professional identity, but also in their private lives, is being rendered increasingly unfit for purpose. Rendered unfit for purpose as a result of the intrusion of digital technologies into the very fabric of their lives. This is the growing phenomenon of more and more people, certainly in the expensive, polished cities of the West, but not only there, that they need to undertake a set of revisions. They need to undertake a set of recalibrations, a set of recalculations, even perhaps of reinventions. And, largely through these things, getting hold of the latest iPhone, taking the latest Netflix recommendation, or getting hold of the latest Pokemon Go update, in order to be able to get on and to confront the challenges of today. And yet, I think curiously, much more than that, because the insidious implantation of anxiety that whatever recalibrations, whatever restructurings, whatever recalculations of their lives and their identities that they're going to undertake today, this gnawing worry in the back of your mind that whilst this may be good enough to see you through the challenges of today, that this won't be adequate to confront the challenges of tomorrow. Yeah. And that, therefore that this whole thing is going to start again from scratch and on in a kind of infinite regress. Well, this world of technological tsunami, I certainly mean by it, these things, so smartphones, but smart environments. The studio that I'm standing in now is fitted out with all the latest high-tech gadgetry. And of course, smart cities. And Tokyo would be clearly an emblem of the modern high-tech city. But I mean by it much more than just that. I'm referring to the entirety of the digital revolution. So, artificial intelligence, accelerating automation, advanced robotics, big data, algorithmic machine learning, neural networks, Industry 4.0, and the Internet of Things, which of course today is now fast becoming the Internet of Everything. And as if all of that's not, vast enough, as if that's not complex enough for women and men to be trying to get to grips with in these early decades of the 21st century, it's really important that a critical social science of digitalization, I think, should also acknowledge a series of other major global transformations that are happening alongside technological tsunami. Now, I won't have time here to go into any detail about this, but I just note them in passing. Developments in biotechnologies, developments in nanotechnology, and a series of transitions happening in information science more generally. And I think if we connect all of that up, all of that has radical implications for many other global transformations, whether it's climate change or global pandemics. Maybe they're topics that we can discuss later today. So against that backdrop of technological tsunami, perhaps it's not then too surprising that women and men today are starting to get just a little bit worried, starting to get a little bit worried about, well, where is all of this going? What kind of world is artificial intelligence ushering us into? Now, when a debate goes from being nowhere to suddenly being everywhere, you can be sure that it's succeeded by controversy. And I think that's undeniably the case in terms of the debate, the great debate that's now happening over artificial intelligence. We're in a world where, there are great debates now. I mean, every time you look at your social media feed, or you look at a newspaper, turn on the radio, or look at TV news, some magic new claim is being presented about how artificial intelligence is going to radically transform our lives. If you look around at these debates, we've got debates occurring about self-driving cars, flying taxis that are being piloted in Dubai airport, the militarization of drones, and space robots. So, as I say, no worry, no doubt, therefore, that people are starting to just get that little bit concerned about, so what's actually happening to the fabric of society, what's happening to the shape of the world today. Now, one reason why I think people have been getting more alarmed about where things are going is because we have had some fairly cataclysmic warnings, some fairly cataclysmic warnings issued by esteemed public intellectuals, academics, and Nobel laureates. So, for instance, for someone like Elon Musk, a person who presumably knows something about digital disruption, artificial intelligence represents a grave existential threat. This is mirrored in the estimate of the Oxford philosopher Nick Bostrom in his New York Times best-selling book, Superintelligence. Bostrom makes the argument that we're fast now entering into a world where non-biological intelligence is going to equal or outstrip biological intelligence. And he suggests that all of us, that we're just like small children playing around with these devices and these technologies, but we're really sort of playing with a bomb. We've got no idea of the broader long-term consequences of what we're getting caught up in. And perhaps the most cataclysmic warning of all came from the late Cambridge academic Stephen Hawking, who pointed out that artificial intelligence might well turn out to be the very last invention ever created by humanity, because it might well result in the wiping out of humanity itself, no doubt referencing the development of autonomous lethal weapons systems. Now, it's a seminar today. It's a presentation involving two speakers, as Professor Shiobara said. And because not only for that reason, but tonight I would like everyone to be able to go home and sleep well. So I'm just going to suggest that what we do with those big cataclysmic warnings is let's just park them over here. Let's park them to one side, because it's not that I want to wholly neglect them, but in the time that I've got available to me today, I want to suggest, working from my discipline in sociology, that there are indeed many factors to be worried about with the development of AI, but there are also many stunning new opportunities, and that I think we can develop a different sociological take on much of this if we turn to look at ordinary, everyday, mundane practices. And that really takes me to the point that artificial intelligence is not what you think. Now, obviously, I'm sort of being held hostage to fortune here because I don't really know what it is that you all think, but I'm just making a fairly straightforward sociological point. AI is not necessarily what you think, but it is increasingly just what you do. You know, every time you take a new sort of update of an app or a bot, or every time you take a get hold of the latest, Apple Watch, all of these, or take the Netflix recommendation, all of these developments, these human-machine interfaces are transformations whereby our everyday lives are becoming increasingly caught up, in the fabric of these automated intelligent machines, and whether we know it or not. So it's against that backdrop, ladies and gentlemen, that in the time that I've got left to me, I want to try and do just two things in this time left. Firstly, drawing from a book that I wrote in 2019 titled The Culture of AI, I want to simply just rehearse and rattle through a whole host of different things that I think are fairly self-evident or obvious about these AI-enabled complex systems which are now powering up modern societies. I'm going to do that quite quickly, and I apologize if you've heard me run through this material before, or I apologize if you already know this material quite well. In the latter part of what I want to say, I'm going to go on and say, secondly, something slightly more slowly about the relationship between AI on the one hand and global transformations on the other. And I want to do that drawing on this new book that I've just published, Making Sense of AI, which looks at the future, or more accurately, the possible futures that artificial intelligence is opening up for us to engage with. So that's the structure of what I want to do. Now, in the culture of AI, I think I outlined something like 13 different AI-enabled complex systems. I'm going to save you from that today. I just want to swiftly move through five of what I think are the most significant. The first, with this one here, the first, I'm just underscoring something about the extensity, the scale, and the scope of artificial intelligence today on a planetary level. We know that AI has its origins in geopolitics, which it both impacts and transforms. That's not a claim I'm going to go on to develop in any way further here. I would just simply refer you to Richard Baldwin's very interesting book, I think, called Globotics. Baldwin makes the argument that AI constantly interlaces with the forces of globalization. He's talking about global processes of outshoring and offshoring, but also reshoring as well. And he tells lots of interesting stories in that book, stories about, for example, hotel rooms in London now being cleaned through tele robotics, cleaned by these people behind their computers in cheap labor spots around the globe. He asks the question, is that the future of the global economy? In terms of trying to assess the scale and scope of artificial intelligence, one way to do that, I think we should bear in mind that AI has, as a narrative, has fundamentally been about the narrative of power. We see this clearly with the AI race, the attempt of nations and of states to try to exploit advances in AI to give them socio-economic advantages. And if you wanted to get a handle, if you ask the question, so, where are these concentrations of power today? You could do worse than trying to identify the different AI hubs. So where are they? Well, we know they're in Silicon Valley, New York, Boston, London, Beijing, Shenzhen. That tells us something about these global concentrations of power. Another way you could do this is by, now I apologize in advance, if you just take a look at this chart here, this is it's an interesting chart. This is sort of these research and development national investment strategies, these AI national strategies. Some of this is a bit out of date now, but you'll see in early 2017 there, you might notice that Japan was very early on in the game to start to develop an AI national strategy. But from all those different flags, you'll see the ways in which different countries around the globe have sought to scale up research and development in artificial intelligence. Australia actually came very late. That's why we're not on that chart there. We didn't really come into this until about 2019. And it was my good fortune to be appointed to the government's review of artificial intelligence in this country. Although the then administration, the Turnbull administration, was superseded by the Morrison administration, and there has not really been much of an outcome on what Australia is going to do in terms of its investment into an AI R&D strategy for the country. We were looking at, there was talk, figures of some tens of millions of dollars was being talked about by government ministers, but that hasn't happened. It's interesting, if you compare that to what's happened elsewhere in the world, you can just get a sense of the scale of all of this. So, in a country, for example, like the United Kingdom, some $1.3 billion is being invested in R&D between now and 2025. In France, it's, I think, $1.8 billion. But the point is, all of those scales pale in comparison if we compare them on a regional basis. So if you look, for example, at what the European Union's doing, it's investing over $20 billion into AI between now and out to 2030. And that too pales in comparison to what those right at the top of the AI race are doing, namely the United States and China. China's on record as saying that it will invest some more than $200 billion into AI between now and 2030. So perhaps little wonder that one industry estimate has it that AI could generate in excess of some $16 trillion to the global economy by the year 2030. The second AI-enabled system that I just want to draw your attention to is that of automaticity. Automaticity, a rather unlovely term that perhaps only a sociologist might come up with. I'm simply just wanting to refer to the fact that more and more of sort of our daily lives and our daily happenings are increasingly threaded through with automated algorithmic systems. It's actually an economist that's captured this rather well, Brian Arthur, and I'll quote from him. Arthur talks about the emergence of this second economy that sits sort of, parasitic upon the physical economy. And Arthur writes, and I quote, that the second economy, which is a software-based AI-driven automation system, is, he says, running an awful lot of the economy. It's helping architects design buildings. It's tracking sales and inventory. It's getting goods from here to there, executing trades and banking operations, controlling manufacturing equipment, manufacturing design calculations, billing clients, navigating aircraft, and much else. The third complex AI-enabled system. Here, I'm just simply trying to underscore that AI is increasingly wall-to-wall, yeah? I'm referring to the fact that these complex digital systems today are everywhere, transferring and coding and sorting and resorting digital information more or less, yeah, more or less instantaneously across global networks. So you could think of that as a kind of, background to our lives, a kind of wallpaper to what's going on. Adam Greenfield captures this very nicely, I think, when he says that AI systems are everywhere, W-H-E-R-E, and everywhere, W-A-R-E. But the key point here is that these systems are largely invisible, yeah? They're unseen, they go undetected. And it's a bit like, therefore, it's a bit like something like, God or globalization. You don't actually clap eyes on it, but it is, just the protological infrastructure. It's the protological infrastructure that provides all of the authorizations and the connectivities and the calculations and the uploads and the downloads that make life just magically, apparently, happen. We're getting through these quickly now, I hope. The fourth AI-enabled complex system, I'm just trying to underscore here that these are systems that are increasingly complex and complicated, yeah? Complex and complicated, referring to AI-enabled systems as underpinning the rise of ubiquitous computing, which is at the core of these, sort of exponential rates of growth, technological innovation that we're seeing happening today. And the key thing that's really been referenced here, of course, has been, at least since the 1960s, Moore's law. Moore's law, the so-called doubling of computing power every 18 months to 2 years. And there's been, of course, now, this in terms of the shrinkage of these transistors and this sort of onto the circuitry that's used for many of these complex systems. There's been a big debate about what's happening with Moore's law, with companies like IBM and Intel saying that we might have reached the end of the line for Moore's law, that there's a limit to miniaturization. So that's one school of thought. Then there's another school of thought saying, no, there's no reason to be alarmed. If you look at what's happening with developments in quantum computing, coupled to the spread of cloud computing today, rest assured, everything's okay. Moore's law and the associated exponential levels of technological innovation will continue unabated. I'm not trying to answer that question, but I would just simply draw your attention to the point that it is not simply a question of technology. It's not just a technological issue, this, because as Helga Nowotny's argued in a former book of hers, An Orderly Mess, these increasing complexities, these increasing complications of world of big data and datafication increasingly press in on all of us. And these are complexities that need to be managed by the individual in terms of your schedule and your calendar and your lifestyle. And that takes me very conveniently, ladies and gentlemen, to the last point the last trend I'd like to emphasize is that AI is not necessarily an out there process, but it is an in here happening. So what I mean by that is I think it's a mistake, we often see this in various accounts of AI. It's a mistake to see AI as being only about organizations or institutions or infrastructures. AI is equally about intimacies and identities. Another way of making that point would be to say that AI actually goes all the way down. Yeah, it goes all the way down, right into the very heart of human subjectivity, right into the very fabric of our personal lives. So it's to do with identity and friendship, romance, sexuality, intimacy, and the body, a remarkably broad swathe of social change. So now in the time remaining to me, I want to move on from where I got to, and much of that came from this book I wrote, as I mentioned, The Culture of AI, and to go on to say something about this new book of mine, the Making Sense of AI. And this is a book in part that moves away from systems and looks out to futures to ask the question of, well, what kind of world will these AI-enabled systems possibly generate? And in the book, I talk about these 4 different scenarios relating to the social impacts of AI at global scale. Now, rather than rehearse fixed and closed sort of blueprints, the 4 scenarios that I develop actually involve fairly broad-ranging views of the future. And I do this in the book by looking at scenarios for AI emanating from various government reviews across the world, as well as consulting programs such as the legendary Foresight program developed in the UK that used scenario building specialists. Now, I don't have the time in the last 10 minutes here to go into any detail about these various scenarios, but I would just like to say that some of the futures I sketch are fairly high tech in orientation. The algorithms and the automations which today spread throughout social life are really raised to the second power in some of these scenarios. These are possible worlds in the years ahead which are going to see massive data highways as the new shipping routes for economic trade. It's a world where smart factories and a novel blend of what might be called Industry 5.0 and the Internet of Things will come to optimize processes, predict maintenance, send early warning alerts, and enforce quality control. It's a world where economy and society will come to be equated with cloud or edge computing, embedding intelligent devices, advanced machine learning models, nanobots, super smart sensors, and much more. But as I say, I'm going to leave talk of the impending technological singularity to one side, and instead I want to focus here very briefly on 2 of the more down-to-earth scenarios. So the first scenario is what I call the future now. I call it the future now because it's been crystallized, of course, from 2020 on in the global pandemic of COVID-19. And in this future, only recently experienced throughout the world, and as the global pandemic delivers huge economic, social, and public health impacts, probably for decades to come, AI has been playing a central role. This is certainly true, as we know, in terms of science and the discovery of vaccines, but it's equally true, I think, at the level of everyday life. In the aftermath of COVID-19, people ramped up their reliance on AI-enabled digitalization to start living in a way they simply hadn't before, mostly working remotely from home, learning online, conducting meetings through Zoom, and generally switching lifestyles from face-to-face interaction to digital interaction as lockdown conditions unfolded. And what we find in this future, in fact, I think I try to identify two different types, 2 different versions of AI here in the future now. So these are the sort of functional responses on the one hand and the sort of complex responses on the other. Just let me briefly contrast these. So the functional future is a scenario played out with the arrival of COVID-19, I think. And here the scale and the speed of remote technologies has been absolutely vital. You've had companies like Microsoft and Google seeking to upscale their various cloud services, with the result being to make calls and video conferencing systems more capable of meeting the demands of remote workforces. AI has also been deployed to combat an array of threats that was amplified early on with COVID-19. So, according to one estimate, Google used AI technologies to block over 18 million coronavirus scam emails daily targeted at Gmail users right in the earliest stages of the pandemic. Now, as you might recall, there were various critics that were pretty quick off the mark to associate COVID-19 with the newly emerging de-globalization. COVID-19, so the commentator said, had brought the world's factories to a standstill and severely disrupted global supply chains. The era of peak globalization, so some argued, was dead. Yet, this conclusion is plainly wrong. For one thing, it completely overlooks the point that globalization involves not only the movement of goods and objects around the world, but also the movement of ideas, information, and data. David Autor has shown that the global pandemic compressed into only a few months what otherwise would have taken possibly years as regards the shift towards remote working. But as we know, this didn't just happen in offices. Schools, universities, healthcare professionals, psychotherapists, even politicians moved swiftly from face-to-face to digital interaction. And in all of this, tech enters into the COVID-19 picture as a kind of control center. Even at the personal level, what did it look like? Well, from digital dinner parties to Facebook funerals, women and men were to make their social environments ever more technologically mediated. They began trying out and trying on digital social lives. Humans might have been quarantined, but thankfully intelligent machines were on hand to keep things working. Now, the argument that AI functioned as a kind of technological control center to manage the future has some plausibility, but the impacts of AI on economic, financial, and social flows did not simply follow any predetermined rules. I suggest they were actually radically open-ended, even, quite uneven in their consequences across different sectors of society. Consider, for example, some of the unexpected disruptions that took place in retail, in global supply chains, as well as marketing and business integration. Huge changes in buying habits took place in early 2020. If you look at the top 10 search items under Amazon, captures this really well. So things like toilet paper, face masks, hand sanitizer, mobile laptop desks, workout shorts, board games, and jigsaw puzzles. This is just what people were suddenly buying, and buying in a frenzy in 2020. Yet a key problem was that the input data on consumer purchases during the early months of the coronavirus crisis differed dramatically from the standard consumer data that AI had previously been trained on. So the result was a kind of wayward AI, These vast, unexpected, unplanned for, and unanticipated bulk orders actually broke many of the predictive algorithms. It's also evident in the services sector too. You had a massive surge in the number of people, on Netflix, for example, looking for entertainment, disrupting the automated operations of many of the streaming services, which encountered problems in managing their recommendation algorithms. So the automated feedback loops had gone awry, but there were sort of glaring mismatches then between data, feedback, and predictive allocations and consumer demands. So I'd suggest to you that rather than seeing technology as a kind of control center, in this version, you get a focus on adaptation, cultural shift, exposure, and adjustment. Uncertainty, algorithmic style, begets not just the demand for a reassertion of control, it actually just states instead towards an ongoing recalibration between humans on the one side and machines on the other. Finally, let me just say something now about this second and last future, which is an AI climate future. Now, here again, there are two strongly contrasting interpretations. The first grants AI a really central role, I think, in trying to realize a low carbon, possibly even a post-carbon climate future. The second positions AI as a key plank in the dominant economic order and actually projects a terrible future where new technologies fuel the burning of the planet. Now, in the first one, which I am referring to as AI-powered degrowth, this involves the effective algorithmic technologies available today to reverse the burning of fossil fuels and associated global warming of the planet. This reversal is intricately interwoven with the emergence of new technological forms bound up with carbon capitalism. So from reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and especially CO2, to reversing the world's rising sea levels, technological advances in AI, it's being argued by many, could be vital to our chances of confronting global climate change today. And of course, examples abound. Just consider Google, which has recently automated cooling of its data centers through utilizing DeepMind's AI to reduce energy consumption by some 30%. To do this, DeepMind's cloud-based AI used thousands and thousands of sensors to take a kind of snapshot of these cooling systems across Google's data facilities. It was an overview of the tech giant's carbon footprint that was fed through these deep neural networks and which in turn made recommendations for minimizing energy usage. Now that is of course only one example. And for that future scenario to emerge, you'd have to have AI technologies facilitating a new post-carbon energy system systematically implemented around the world. A lot of commentators think that that's possible. Many others say, well, it could be pie in the sky. So in a second interpretation then, AI is cast in direct conflict with progressive climate change goals and energy efficiency ambitions. Here, AI technologies are seen as already contributing significantly to hugely expensive energy consumption. Moreover, the likely escalation in automatically controlled intelligent machine systems of production and consumption, travel, transport, and tourism, as well as those of leisure and pleasure, are such that ecological catastrophe is thought an increasingly likely future for the 21st century. Now, various surveys lend support to this kind of skepticism. The US Department of Energy has estimated that data centers worldwide are consuming around 200 terawatts of power per year. That kind of energy consumption is in excess of what many countries are now using. Research in the US has also identified AI and driverless cars and robots as key forces leading to the possible tripling of worldwide power. Anders Andre, a Swedish research engineer, has estimated that by 2025, global computing power could use 20% of worldwide electricity supply. All of that underscores that AI technologies and global computing are using more of the world's electricity than any country except the US, China, and India. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me sum up here. I mean, this is a deeply complicated future scenario. It's an extremely difficult one to assess the likelihood of these different interpretations. The AI degrowth future assumes that new technologies are going to be sufficient to offset environmental damage and foster low carbon or post-carbon energy solutions, whether incremental or even innovative improvements to energy security resulting from AI technologies based upon more efficiency and better design could actually produce such a social future appears, I think, unlikely. Some argue that AI breakthroughs are likely to be more radical and transforming, impacting the world in quite radical ways. But the point is that such projected breakthroughs are by definition the least predictable and almost impossible to assess in terms of policy considerations and socioeconomic development. The second interpretation I've outlined to you highlights that AI technologies are in fact already bound up with energy sources of carbon capitalism, and therefore that it's difficult to see exactly how these technologies might ever transfigure or shift beyond carbon energy intensive practices. Yet it is again crucial, I think, that we bear in mind the open-endedness of social futures. If AI research and innovation can contribute to new ways of storing electricity, it follows that this would actually have an enormous impact on energy security. Various developments concerning electricity storage, such as flow batteries and power conversion systems, are key as possible storage technologies, and when combined with AI, offer possibly progressive ways forward towards the powering down of societies to low carbon economies. So again, ladies and gentlemen, as I'm out of time, I say to you, what do these future scenarios that I've drawn out today, what do they capture? Well, I think they highlight social worlds where smart algorithms play various roles in delegating tasks, various roles in delegating decisions to artificial agents and automated intelligent machines. Where is all of this heading? Is it crash through or is it crash? Either way, my point is this is not just a technological issue. It's not just an issue for the technological experts. It is something for all of us, for women and men today to be engaged. We have to find a way to fight back. We have to find a way to see that the kind of intersections of human intelligent, automated intelligent machines becoming perhaps one of the most fundamental issues that will define the 21st century. For anyone that wants to know more about all of this, it's set out in this remarkably comprehensive and very glossy book that's just been published and available at all good bookshops. I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much for listening. Arigatou gozaimasu.
Thank you very much for your wonderful and exciting lectures. So now we have a time for question and discussion on the lecture of Professor Elliott. If you have any question or comments on him, please raise your hand on Zoom. Okay, so Professor, so I can see Chen Ting.
Hello, can you hear my voice?
Yes, I can hear you.
Sorry, I think I'm in a dark environment. I'm sorry for that. Basically, I have 2 comments and 1 question. The first question is that I think I learned a lot from this lecture, and I think AI is really important. And like some societies like Japan and China, we are now facing aging people and the shortage of young people. So I think AI in like Japan and China, we take AI as a solution for the future healthy care for the elderly. So I think this is a really important point. The second one is that like the lecturer just mentioned that AI is now in here happenings. So at the very beginning, we think AI is something really far and something in the future, but now it's just happening around us. So maybe some of you have heard that the Facebook company, they are trying to create the meta universe, the metaverse. So it's like it's a very future lifestyle, and it it concerned me a lot that we also know that the cyberpunk. So we are afraid of that in the future, those big companies will control the world. And this is the second thing. And I would like to know how do you think about that. And the third one is why I am so interested in this lecture, because I am a researcher in the human relations. It's like AI is something they try to it's like they try to have some how to say, because I am in human relations, so I don't know how to make something related with AI, like have some product or something, technology things. So I'm wondering, what can we do as scholars and students in the human relations to tackle with the topic related with CIs? That's all. Thank you so much.
So, Chen-san, thank you very much for those really interesting and broad range of questions. And there's a lot there to unpack, which I don't have time to do that. I'm just simply going to agree with what you said on the first point, particularly about demography and the challenges as to where much of this heads. But really to pick up on your central point, I think about a kind of human-machine interface, because I think this is, at least to my mind, this is, I was trying to say at the end of my talk, and it's really one of the fundamental questions that we see on the public political agenda today. There you go, I can see you much better now. So as I see it, I think the AI is the site today of two huge forms of struggle. And as you rightly say, I mean, the first account there is that of sort of the way private life on the one hand and public space on the other. So, you know, in terms of the way you've sketched that out, I mean, do we want to live in a world where whenever you go and have a cup of coffee, whether it's at Starbucks, you know, we know that there's this facial recognition technology that immediately is capturing our reactions to this sort of stuff and feeding it straight back to big tech. You know, is that the sort of world that you want to live in? Well, it's not the sort of world I want to live in. So I think that's an area of major controversy and conflict and of struggle. The other is, as you rightly say, that between humans and automated intelligent machines. There are various institutional attempts now to try and grapple with this. I'm following very closely developments at the IEEE, the United Nations, the ethics, looking at the ethics of autonomous systems. And of course, there's been the work of the moment over the last few years, Shoshana Zuboff's Surveillance Capitalism. These are all very important academic and public political developments, I would suggest. But I think in terms of, and that was the point where I was trying to say that AI goes all the way down, that we need to see it as not just being about institutions and infrastructures, it's about us as people, it's our identities. I think, you know, the work that you're doing, and I think work that other colleagues in humanities and social sciences are doing is tremendously important, because you know, in terms of subjectivity of interpersonal relationships and our relations with the wider world, we're only, I think, just at the very beginning of understanding the intersections between all of that and, you know, algorithmic power, algorithmic governmentality. Certainly the work that I'm doing with a lot of my colleagues here at the Jean Monnet Center of Excellence, some of that work has started to look, for instance, at the emergence of what I'm terming algorithmic intimacy. And I think it's really important to try and understand that, you know, we don't all have the same types of reactions to these automated machines. How I react to this might be quite different to how you react to it. We need to know much more about those differences. We need to know much more about, as it were, the kind of ideologies or the rhetorical forms that are constituted and come into play. So I think there's much here that social sciences and humanities can do. And I thank you for those questions, because I think you've gone right to the heart of where I probably finished up in what I was saying today.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Tintin-san. And so do you have any other question? Okay, I can see Mr. Shibata, please.
Thank you for speaking with us today. I'm Shinnosuke Shibata from Keio University Business Faculty. I have one question. Have you heard of the SoftBank Vision Fund? They are making a huge investment in AI. They are diversifying their investments in so many AI companies. But there are many people who criticize their strategy. Do you think they will be successful in the next few years? Do you think the future they envision, future they are drawing is coming true?
So thank you for that question. I know a little bit about SoftBank, but in terms of, I think what you're asking about the likely trajectories, particularly in terms of business and enterprise, again, much of this is radically open-ended. Certainly from one angle, I think there's been a great deal of hype in terms of the business community. There's been a fair bit of hat tipping towards AI, where companies are saying that they're wanting to, take on board these latest technological advances to kind of power up their operations. So in a sense, we're waiting. The reason I, in today's talk, tried to underscore those R&D investment strategies was to put those, the context of what's occurring in business and enterprise today, not only in a national context, but to put it into a comparative context as well. So that, I do think, again, trying to answer this question, for my own sense of it is that there is a massive shift happening very recently in machine learning. So if you look at, what's happened out of DeepMind, the whole phenomenon around Go and AlphaGo. The fact that you had AlphaGo defeat the world's champion at Go, and that since that time, the emergence of AlphaGo 2 has gone on through training itself up from nothing, to beat AlphaGo 100 games to 0. Well, I just don't think that those in the social sciences and the humanities can say, well, that's just technical detail. We don't need to be concerned with that. That's a massive change that we all have to sort of come to grips with and think about what the implications of that might be. China clearly is doing that. There's a very good book. I just will finish by suggesting you might want to have a look at this if you haven't already, Kai-Fu Lee's book, AI Superpowers, because there the interesting connections made between those developments out of DeepMind and AlphaGo 2 and the some 400 million people in China that watched all of that, and in parts of South Korea, watched all of that actually happen in real time on television. And Kai-Fu Lee makes the claim, well, perhaps it's not therefore just, sheer folly that the Chinese government's gone on to announce the $200 billion of investment into AI. So again, this is all rather open-ended. I don't think any of us can actually say what's going to happen with SoftBank. No one can know with any degree of confidence where it's going. What we're seeing with a lot of these new digital technologies is it's a sort of one step forwards, two back, or one sideways. But there's no doubt we live in interesting times.
Thank you for answering.
Thank you very much. So next question should be Mr. Yu Ono, please.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor Everest. It was very thought-provoking and wonderful lecture. And my name is Yu Ono from the Graduate School of System Design and Management of Keio University. So my question is about the communication with AI. So I'm currently working on some projects about the community design in the local areas of Japan. And the challenges that I always face with is how to make sense of the result that AI or like data analysis creates. For example, if AI algorithm may be able to lead or they come up with the optimized answers, but whether or not people understand and get convinced with the result is another. So I would like to hear your thoughts and ideas on what could we possibly better do to better communicate with the people, including those who are tech savvy and non-tech savvy.
So, Ono-san, thank you for the question. I would suggest you and your colleagues are right at the heart of a really fundamental question in terms of current AI research. So a lot of the research, I've been following some of this quite closely in terms of particularly conversational transactions and developments of what's actually happening with our conversations today. And not just the rise of Siri and Alexa, but if we're looking at, the spread of, soft bots and conversational agents in broader scale retail and customer service today, I think that all of this raises some really fascinating questions about the nature of communication, about the nature of talk. I put the emphasis on talk rather than language. I think, again, sociology has much to contribute to this debate, thinking of the works of people like the late Irving Goffman and many others. If it's the case that more and more of us are spending time talking to, some of us believe we're talking with automated intelligent machines, what might be the spillover? Yeah, what might be the spillover into how we talk with other colleagues at work? How might this impact on how we talk to loved ones at home? Now, we already know from looking at smartphone usage, been big changes in communication patterns. Is the world just headed on a trajectory where we're simply transmitting emojis between people around the globe? So what's going to be the fallout from artificial intelligence? We've been doing quite a bit of work on this, and I'd like to talk to you more about it. But I will just say that last point also that you emphasized could be a very nice segue into what Professor Nowotny is going to talk about, I think, this afternoon, because much of her work about this kind of the illusions of predictive algorithms, the notion of these of the power of machine learning algorithms as interdiction, of these algorithms as sort of being represented as they're sort of providing recommendations, but they're really providing normativities that many people are now acting upon, and then you get the kind of self-fulfilling prophecies standpoint and scenario. But thank you for the question. It's very, very interesting.
Thank you. So next will be Mr. Ben Pollock, please.
Yes, I'm not sure if there we go. My camera's not working, but
No
just a couple of things. Just the first thing is, Professor Elliott, I actually just read one of your papers today. I didn't even know you were going to be presenting tonight, so that was interesting. But my question is more about, I guess, as we're stepping into this new world, we've already loaded so much of our data and our behaviors and everything online. And I just wonder about how much of our, I guess, personal agency we're going to have left by the time we actually catch up with where these algorithms are at and the governance over their usage, if that makes sense. I don't know if you can just speak to that quickly.
Yes, so thanks very much, Ben. So that, I think, I can see you now. The intersection there between sort of, data selves on the one hand, and, the sort of, if I could put it this way, the kind of pre-digital forms of subjectivity. I mean, obviously from one angle, digitalization, I'm arguing it goes all the way down, but I don't know how true it is to say that it goes fully all the way down. That's to say there are still aspects of our subjectivity. Here I'm going to lean towards Freud somewhat, because we're born prematurely and because we're fundamentally dependent on others initially for our survival and in terms of care and connection. There's a great deal that digitalization, whilst we are obviously enmeshed in this increasing world of thoroughgoing digitalization, there's much that we need to worry about and sort of try to think over in terms of that relationship between sort of pre-reflective aspects of human subjectivity, core emotional and affective aspects of our lives on the one hand, and then these kind of newly constituted and constantly reconstituted data selves on the other. Now, you might come away from reading someone like Zuboff's Surveillance Capitalism, which provides this exquisite map and overview of what actually is happening in terms of the transaction between data selves and tech companies. And, you know, I think there's no doubt that we owe her a great deal for what's been done on that score. Whether it works as well when we start to think about things like the nature of, you know, the sort of intrusion of algorithms into the militarized order of today, when we look at administrative and bureaucratic systems of control, it seems to me that there are lots of arguments there to consider as well. So again, the jury's out on much of this. And I think we're still at very early stages of trying to think through the possible responses of individuals and communities. But I mean, where I was headed towards the end of the talk is, you know, we need to be engaged. We need a fight back here, because at the level of concerns over privacy, I mean, this is obviously, you know, the central issue when many people think of what it's like to live in a world of intensive and extensive artificial intelligence.
Yep, no, thank you.
Thank you. So the next will be the last question on him. So Mr. or Miss Gurudut Jaga, I'm sorry about that. Gurudut Jagaridara, please. I'm sorry.
大丈夫です。なんとか頑張りましたね。ありがとうございました。Hello, Professor Elliott. This is Gurachi. I'm from the Graduate School of Media Design, KU, PhD. Thanks for the awesome lecture. Some thoughts came into my mind. I'm just going to share it with you, and maybe you could react to it. I think the notion is that God made man in his own image, and now man is making AI in his own image. And my worry is, where is women in all this design and development of the human augmentation that's happening right now? The other thing that comes to my head is humanity is imperfect. We have our biases. We are very xenophobic by majority. And we have so many other racial or prejudices that we're still struggling with. Are we carrying these imperfections forward into this AI era? And the last thought that comes to my mind is, if this AI is developing its own ability to think, perceive, and respond or be responsive, then is it a sentient being, or is it just a tool?
Sorry, is it a
sentient being? Like, can you demarcate it as a sentient being, or is it just a tool that does the thinking for us, just like the calculator or just like an abacus in the olden days?
Yeah, well, on that, thank you very much. On that last point, so there's a huge amount of disagreement between technologists and boosters on the one side and skeptics on the others as to you know, whether the increasingly complex and complicated nature of artificial intelligence systems will be able to move to that next level of general artificial intelligence. But certainly, you know, I mean, if you were to, you know, we're talking about language and communication and talk. I mean, if you go and try to ask those questions, say you went to Google and you went to the natural language processing lab to ask that question, and you talk to its director, a man called Ray Kurzweil. Yes, him, the billionaire inventor. You know, Kurzweil's already on record as having said that essentially these automated conversational agents will be able to produce machine-like conversation of sufficient or the same complexity as to what you and I are having now through these mediated devices by the year 2029. Now, that's not that far away. a lot of people have just criticized Ray Kurzweil as being some futurist crackpot, but I would note that he has a remarkably good track record of predicting futures. I don't, and I'm a sociologist. I don't try to predict futures. I think you've got to be very careful with predicting, certainly anything like the future. But in terms of some of your other points there, particularly in terms of gender and sexuality and the body, I mean, yes, this is a huge part of sort of elements of this has been missing. There's very good work going on, though, that needs to be noted here. I try to trace some of this out in making sense of AI. So, I mean, again, just given that we're talking about it, in respect of conversational agents, Siri, Alexa, and all the rest of it, some very impressive work that's been done recently, trying to get to grips with, you know, the highly gendered nature of many of these conversational assistants, looking at trying to link these digital developments back to sort of various pre-digital forms of gender relationships and how these are being replicated and amplified and developed and deepened. And I think it's certainly true that if you're looking at social inequalities today, AI is not just, you know, I mean, it is, we know it's not some objective medium as technologists so often represent it to be. It's absolutely constituted to its roots in terms of the prejudices and the ideologies and the belief systems that all of us carry as human subjects in advanced in modern societies. So from that angle, it's not surprising, is it, that artificial intelligence systems are going to reproduce those very biases and those concerns that many of us have. And it's why, obviously, if you look at attempts to try to regulate and address this today, for example, at the level of the European Union, but at other regional levels as well, there's a much greater focus now on the development of trustworthy AI and other forms of new types of governance to get to grips with our digitalized world.
Thank you very much again for your wonderful lecture, Professor Elliott, and people who make important questions. So now it's time to introduce our second lecturer today, Professor Helga Nowotny, and she's an she's a professor Emeritus of Science and Technology Studies, ETH Zurich, and a founding member of the European Research Council. And she's one of the leading sociologists today and have experienced a lot of important academic positions in Europe and other areas. And she also recently published her latest book titled "In AI All We Trust." So Professor Nowotny, so please go ahead.
Thank you very much and welcome to all of you. I'm really delighted to be able to be with you today. I want to thank you, Professor Shiobara, for making this possible. And I would like to thank also my good friend, Anthony Elliott, for having been the person behind making this possible. Having listened to the lecture by Anthony Elliott, you will see that in many ways what I have to say is complementary to what you have already heard. But you will also notice that I take a somewhat different angle in speaking about this so important topic. Now, let me briefly share some of my slides with you. Okay, and can I control it as well, or do you have to control it?
Maybe I will control this, so please suggest, the page.
Sorry. So this is the title of my book, and although I will not have the opportunity to speak about the book as a whole, please next slide. I will want to structure my lecture into three parts. First of all, I would like to put AI into the social context. And this is important because very often in the social sciences, we still tend to believe that all there is to it is the impact of technology on society. In the past century, there was a sociologist by the name of Osborne, whose theory was that of a cultural lag. In other words, he believed technology changes society and society has to adapt to technology. Now, we know that this is a very short-sighted view because it is society, there are social actors, there is investment, as we have heard, there are economic and other incentives that bring forth technology, but there's also the creative part behind technology. So we create it. There are selective forces, which kind of technologies are further developed. And whenever you go back to the history of a particular technology, you can see that there are some kind of different pathways, and Anthony Elliott has told us about the open futures that we are facing. So we are not there as yet where it will lead us. And also in terms of the way how people react to technology, it is more than a pure reaction, it's an appropriation. People change the uses of technology. One example is the transistor, where people discovered you can put it into a small radio device that you can take with you and things of this kind. So all this is one reason why we have to rethink the relationship between a technology, AI, and the way how society takes it up, changes it, learns to live with it. I will then move on to the paradox of predictive algorithm and end up with what I call future needs wisdom. Next slide, please. So this is the cover of my book. Next slide. Next slide. So let me start with something that historians of technology, historians of innovation are very keen to emphasize. This is one of the major radical changes that come out of a technological innovation. And it's called radical because it has the power to change the way how the economic system functions, the way how society takes up the many consequences, and it seeps into our lives, as we have heard, in such a ubiquitous way that this is a paradigm change in how we live, how our economy functions. Now, this is not the first time in human history that this has happened at a massive scale. And of course, the first of these major paradigm changes came with the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century. Of course, there were predecessors to it, and what economic historian Joel Moke has called the culture of growth. It was only towards the midst of the 18th century that something like economic growth happened for the first time. Before, growth was not something that was driving future development. We also see world population figures going up, and the Industrial Revolution, of course, had a huge impact on the way how people were living. It created something like the welfare state as a reaction to mediate, to alleviate the kind of negative fallout it has on the health of people, on their longevity, etc. And it is also the time and a reaction to which we own the emergence, the coming into existence of the social sciences. The social sciences began in 19th century Europe as grappling with the negative fallout of the Industrial Revolution, the so-called social question. But there were also other developments like the invention of insurance against some of the negative fallouts. So these were some of the things that happened in the past. And people like Carlota Perez, another economic historian, has looked very deeply into what can we learn from these previous paradigm changes that might also help us to better understand what is happening today. And what she shows very clearly that there's always a trend towards concentration of economic power. So the big corporations we see today, Google, Microsoft, you name it, it all had predecessors in previous of these paradigm changes and a winner-take-all kind of mentality. In other words, you have monopolies or oligopolies, and the winner takes all. And this is why we should not be surprised, given this historical background, to see that also during the pandemic, we saw that the 1% of the people on this planet who earned most, their wealth increased even further. So this is part of the winner takes all. And what is the answer? Carlota Perez also says that unless there is regulation, unless there is intervention by government, we come to this kind of, in the end, untenable situation because it will create social unrest. Next slide, please. So, of course, history never repeats itself. So the question is, if AI, digitalization, and I will be using this term as a kind of umbrella term that stands for the many processes that we have heard before: machine learning, neural networks, digitalization, automatization, etc. So what is different this time? And here I can only underline what you heard before. There is this global reach. None of what we saw before was immediately global. Eventually, the Industrial Revolution covered the entire globe, but it took decades and decades to do so. Now it happens almost instantaneously, and so is the impact due to already a globally interconnected world, the speed of communication and transportation. But there is also, and this is very interesting that we all come back to this, what happened in the past years when we were facing COVID with different times in different places, but we all are bound together in this first global experience of a pandemic. And it pushed us further into digitalization. AI provided the lifelines to protect us from social isolation, but we also learned that there is something like Zoom fatigue, because our brains, by evolution, are not equipped to read the cues in our social interactions with others by seeing people only as a two-dimensional image on a screen. So the brain constantly tries to figure out, what is the body language, what is behind what we see on the screen, and this is what creates Zoom fatigue. It makes us much more tired than if we were to sit together in the same room and talk to each other. But it also gave us a foretaste of what life in a digital world would actually mean for us in our bodily existence. People realized that they have a yearning to be out in nature. And when there were the various lockdown periods, and they happened practically in all countries, even if the timing was not synchronized, people took plants into their living rooms because they wanted to have a bit of nature nearby. They felt the deficiency of being able to touch each other, to hug each other. So the bodily existence in this digital world is something that we got a foretaste unless we learn how to accommodate this yearning for physical contact, which also means emotional contact with each other and with nature. The pandemic and its push into digitalization also revealed already existing inequalities. And even in the world of science, my background is social studies of science and technology. Even in the world of science, and I followed this closely, we can see that those who suffered most were women scientists, for the simple reason that they were the ones who had to take care of the children at home. And we can see that the scientific productivity of women scientists decreased during the pandemic. Of course, it had also implications for other women that were overburdened, and a kind of return to a division of labor in the family that we thought we had already overcome. But of course, it also opened up new opportunities. The future of work is an open area. There were the fears and even figures that were provided by people who had said, well, you know, AI will now, through automation, destroy so many jobs. This has also happened before, but we also know that new jobs will be created. The question is just, we don't know how fast. So the time element comes in here. And finally, this is what I think is really different this time, is that we have begun a co-evolutionary journey for the first time in the history of the human species between humans and the digital machines created by humans. And this means we are creating machines that become more like humans in terms of having cognitive facilities that we thought before are uniquely human. The machine imitates them, and we are able to create machines that imitate human cognitive facilities, but also emotional qualities. So this is a co-evolution, like it happens in nature between two different species. And this can become a symbiotic relationship where, you know, you compensate what one species can do better and then the other species, or it can turn out into being costly, much more costly for one species compared to the other. And indeed, it is open-ended. Next slide, please. So this is just a reminder for all social scientists, and we should not be shy in emphasizing it whenever we interact with people working in the field of technology or business with technology. It's never technology alone. And coming with an STS background, of course, it is obvious how the social order and the technological order are intertwined. They are intertwined because there are people living in this world, and in the social world, these people have values, and whenever they design technologies, some of these values are also designed into technologies. They have practices in the way how they use technologies, and they never use them exactly in the way how the designers intend them to do. So all this means we have to look at different levels and from different perspectives how the social world, the technological world interact and are really very closely intertwined and tangled even. But then speaking about technology never alone, I think it is also quite useful to compare this AI technology and digitalization with the time of that was initiated by the Industrial Revolution, and that led us to modernity and modernization around the world, which again, it took a very long time. And we discover, and the social scientists, as late as the 1970s, were convinced that there's only one pathway towards modernization. It was called modernization theory. People and countries in the global south would eventually catch up, but they thought there's only one way how to catch up. We now know there are multiple modernities and there are multiple pathways to become modern. And this is therefore a kind of warning against thinking that the way how AI will be appropriated and will be played out in different parts of the world will be uniform. Instead of seeing certain features certainly will be shared, the power of the great and large corporations will be felt around the globe, but nevertheless, we see already now, looking at the way how the US tries to regulate, what Europe does, what China does, there are very big cultural and regulatory differences. But it also means, and here I want to step into, an open door already, the door that was opened by Anthony before speaking before me, that we are quickly learning that in this world of database systems, of sophisticated algorithm, of unprecedented computational power that we have today, there is no longer the kind of linearity that was so typical of the modern world. The modern world left a trace of its linearity in the way how modern cities were designed according to a grid, which differed from the way how ancient cities, where you have circular roads, you have a messy kind of city structure, but people living in the city knew that it was functional for them. And modernity with its linearity was underpinned by the belief into progress, and progress meant it would be better tomorrow than the world is today, but that this progress would proceed in a linear fashion. And this is a belief in progress that is difficult to hold up today, because we can see that tomorrow is not necessarily better in all respects than today. Yes, overall, the world is in better shape, but the linearity and the way how people saw the future as becoming better and better is very hard to sustain for these 8 billion of people that we have to nourish and keep in a healthy state. As the UN's sustainability goals have underlined so strongly, this is the task before us. And there is no linear solution, no linear pathway to get us there. Instead, we have to deal with complex systems. Next slide, please. And realizing that we live in a world of complex systems has much to do with AI and with data, because it is based on data that we now see the networks that make up a complex system. When you make a phone call with your friends, with your relatives, etc., you become part of a network. And the individual phone call is a mere data point in an interconnected network that keeps changing. If you look at supply chains, they are interconnected networks. If you look at a health system, you see the way how data points that come from very different parts of the health system, and this begins with diagnostics, it begins with a doctor or a nurse looking at an X-ray or a scan or another instrument that allows us to see what is happening in our body. All this gets connected to other networks of the doctor prescribing certain medications, the patient replying to the doctor which previous medication he or she had taken, etc. All this together makes up a very complex system of interconnected network. Now, complex systems have at least 3 phenomena, which is important to remember. First of all, they know the phenomena of emergence. This means all of a sudden, new phenomena can arise. New interconnections can come to the force that nobody could predict. Secondly, feedback mechanisms are very important, and feedback can be positive or negative. It can be taken up or not be taken up. And thirdly, this leads to complex systems that may reach a critical point where they go into something that physicists call a phase transition. The state of the system changes, and it may also collapse. And this is where questions related to the environment, to the sustainability crisis that we face as humanity today becomes so important. And AI allows us to model at least part of these processes, to follow part of these networks, and to set up models that allow us to see a little bit further and to warn us and to say, well, look, this particular system, this can also be a banking system, is now reaching a tipping point. But of course, we mostly worry about the tipping points that will be reached regarding climate change, biodiversity, and other features in the degradation of our environment. Now, quickly, the next slide, please, to wrap up this first part of my talk. I just wanted to mention why I wrote this book and how I got into this. And this was, you know, Anthony Elliott mentioned the trouble with AI, you know, the warnings that came from Stephen Hawking, Elon Musk. And, you know, I have a great skepticism if I hear these pronouncements and warnings. And I was also stunned by this bifurcation, the way how the debates on AI unfold, both in the circles of people who actually design them, the people who want to promote them, but also the rest of society that hear these warnings, and of course they start to be afraid. So there is a trap that I wanted to explore, but also to avoid, to fall either to the side of, you know, hype techno-optimists who think that AI now has all the solutions for all of our problems, and on the other hand, the dystopians. And there is no end to a dystopian pessimism, because you can always come up with scenarios that are worse than the already existing ones, but it's a dead end. It does not lead us anywhere. So how to avoid this trap? And then I started to go to conferences. I talked with people, you know, people who set up the Beneficial AI Institute and others. I started to read and get immersed in the literature. And there were times when I felt like being in a maze. And, you know, a maze is a deliberately built structure to confuse you. You don't know where the exit is anymore. And if it takes too long to get out, you really get worried. And at times I felt, you know, I just have to break out of this maze because it is too confusing and too much of a dead end for me. But then I discovered at other times there are structures of thought, of debate that are built like a labyrinth. And a labyrinth is an ancient cultural place deliberately designed to lead the people who seek something like spiritual enlightenment to finally find the center. And I found, to my surprise, that some of the literature dealing with AI leads to such a center. And at the center, there is transhumanism. This is the belief that through AI, we will be able to overcome our humanity, our sense of being human. And there are people who would like to leave the body behind, who would like to become something that, you know, is no longer touched by bodily ills, and they want to become a kind of entity like an AI that can escape the troubles we have on Earth. And so in order to avoid the trap, find out my way both from a maze and from a labyrinth, I thought the best starting point for me is to turn towards predictive algorithms. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. And predictive algorithms lead one back to the ancient wish of wanting to know the future. And anthropologists and historians tell us that there was practically no culture in the history of humanity that did not have divinatory practices, nor was there a lack of divinatory practitioners. And these were technical experts because whatever you were using, the material you were using, you had to have knowledgeable people who knew how to interpret them. But also it took place in a social setting. And one of the old divinatory practices that were only discovered in the beginning of the 19th century were the oracle bones in ancient China. Now, the oracle bones were the bones of sheep or cattle or also tortoises that were held above the fire, and cracks appeared in the bone. And depending on the cracks, the divinatory practitioner was interpreting what he, or sometimes they were also women, saw. But the social setting mattered. And the clients, so to say, the ones who wanted to know their future, were first of all, you know, the people at the court, the mighty people, who wanted to know, is this now time to go into battle, to start a new fight with my neighbors? And so the practitioners had to have social knowledge, because if they would be too direct and too precise, it could turn out that the prediction was wrong, and this was not a good idea for those who set the prediction to someone who was much more mighty and powerful than they were. So this is part of human history, but we still want to know the future. What has changed, and has changed dramatically, is the way how we look at the future. Because in all these different oracle traditions, predictions based on the way how you would inquire, what does nature tell us, what do the gods tell us, etc. The assumption was that fate, destiny were already determined. Only humans did not know them, and this is what the oracle would reveal. And it was only in the time that the German historian Koselleck calls saddle time, like a watershed in a mountain where the river flows to one side and the other side, which was roughly between 750 and 850 in Europe, that people started to discover there is a gap between their experience and with their aspirations, and that the future was not predetermined, but the future had an open horizon. And this is, of course, where science and technology come in. For science, the future is open, everything is possible. We speak about a space of the possibles, and the futures in the plural is something that is part of the scientific worldview. But it was a recent social discovery or social invention. Next slide, please. So knowing the future is of interest because it allows us to extend our control over the future. We want to be prepared, and if we know what is coming, we can prepare all the better. And now we no longer practice divination, at least not for the largest part, or those who think they have left it behind. But we still write many reports. We are very interested what will happen in 2030, in 2050. And something that the pandemic has left both governments, but everyone very strongly convinced of, is that we have to be better prepared for the next time, because another pandemic is likely to come. We don't know where and when. It's part of the unknown knowns. We know it will come, we don't know when and where and in which form. So we keep this interest in the future as a means of better controlling it. And of course, AI allows us to see a bit further into the future, because AI is a great tool extrapolating from the past. AI and predictive algorithms don't have a magic crystal ball. They cannot predict the future that remains uncertain, but they can extrapolate from past data. When you get a notification, you want to buy a book, you order a book on Amazon, and then Amazon sends you 5 other titles or 10 other titles of similar books that you might be interested in. And this is based on your past behavior. The same holds for restaurants, for your preferences in meeting other young people, dating apps, etc. They're all based on the extrapolation from the past, and this is why data are needed. But the prediction itself, the algorithm itself, cannot see the future, but it extrapolates and leads us to see further into the future. Now, of course, we had other ways of trying to manage uncertainty and coping with uncertainty, which is another way of saying extending our control over the future, or trying to extend our control. And one of them, of course, is statistics. Statistics also allows us to see, what is the average longevity? Do women become older now in Japan, or is it men? Or who was affected by COVID more, etc. All this is based on statistical averages. And of course, statistics is based on probabilities. The difference is, however, that the predictive algorithm can target a group of people, but basically it is designed in a way to predict something to an individual. So from a certain sense, you can say, the loop closes to the old way how oracles function, telling an individual, this will be your future. And you are the supplicant, and I am the oracle or the practitioner, and I tell you now what will happen, and I speak to you as an individual. While if you have statistical averages, you hear from your doctor, there's a certain probability, then the doctor reassures you, but the statistics never apply to an individual, and indeed probability can never say anything about the individual. It can only give you probabilities that relate to the reference population. Next slide, please. So this is where social behavior comes in on a massive scale. And this is the risk I see of self-fulfilling prophecy, because predictive algorithms are a powerful tool. They are a tool that is entering into our lives, into institutions, into the way how we relate to decision-making on a massive scale. And here we transfer human agency, and this is an important concept in sociology, as you're much aware of. We transfer human agency to the predictive algorithm, and we start to believe what the predictive algorithm tells us will happen in the future will actually happen, and we adjust our behavior accordingly. And self-fulfilling prophecies is a term that was coined already in the 1930s by a sociologist by the name of Thomas. And for me, what is most interesting is this paradox, because on the one side, we use AI very deliberately to help us cope with uncertainty, to control the future. And at the same time, the performativity of AI, the power of agency that we transfer to it, that makes us believe that it is so powerful, performativity makes us behave in ways it predicts, and this reduces our agency. That's the paradox. It reduces our agency because now it's the AI that dictates or makes us believe this is our future. Next slide, please. Let us take a short step back and just ask the question. I think it's always important to, also for social scientists, to have a historical sensibility and to ask ourselves, where did it all start and how did it develop the way it is now? And the beginnings of the digital age go back roughly towards the 1940s, so the last century. So it's quite some decades. Of course, algorithms have existed since people were doing mathematics already in Babylonian times, because an algorithm is nothing but a rule that tells you what steps to take next. Leibniz had already, in the 18th century, the first kind of computation machine based on zeros and ones. We know about Ada Lovelace, a woman in the 19th century, together with Charles Babbage, who was very important in setting up calculation machines. So all this has some predecessors, as you always find. But what happened is that for the first time, code, the way how you instruct mathematically a machine to do certain steps, were brought together with hardware, with an electronic working computer. And this happened, again, there were predecessors, but it happened roughly at that time in Princeton, the Institute of Advanced Princeton. Alan Turing, whose mathematical ideas were the foundation of this new development, brought the mathematical ideas. The Turing machine is not a machine, it's a piece of mathematics, very powerful and convincing, but it's a piece of mathematics. And it was brought together with the hardware. John von Neumann, one of the polymaths working in the war effort against Nazi Germany to develop the bomb where instrumental in setting it up. And it's interesting looking back to see that there is a twin development working towards the atomic bomb and the onset of the Anthropocene. You know that we speak about the Anthropocene since Paul Crutzen first mentioned this, an environmental chemist and Nobel Prize winner. He spoke about it in the year 2000 and saying, well, we are now entering a new age, the age of the Anthropocene, because we can see the massive changes that humans have brought to the Earth system. And the geologists were the timekeepers of the history of the Earth, because they are the ones who decide when does an era, a period, end in the history of the Earth. They ask for evidence. And the evidence has to be physical evidence. You have to have material traces. How did humans change the system of the Earth? And the most likely candidate, they've been working on this for some time now, the most likely candidates are the radioactive traces left by the first nuclear tests that were conducted underground in the US before the atomic bomb was developed. So you have an interesting, convergence coming together, a coincidence that may or may not be a coincidence between the development of the atomic bomb and the onset of the Anthropocene. And in the 1950s, we have another phenomenon. So this is, in terms of the time we speak of, it's not so far away in the 50s. We see all the indicators of human activities shooting up: consumption, GDP, water supply, water use, etc. You take any indicator and you see a surge of indicators. And at the same time, you see a rise in indicators, seeing how changes in the Earth system change accordingly. And this is called the Great Acceleration. So we have this convergence now that has matured over decades of big data, sophisticated algorithm, unprecedented computational power. And the question is, what does it do with us, but also what do we do with it? Next slide, please. And one of the many facets that I am interested in is the element of time. What is the impact of predictive algorithms in particular on our temporal experience? And in my view, with the computer, with digitalization, we also have added an additional layer in our experience of time. There's physical time, there is biological time, and we as biological beings have the arrow of time inscribed in us that leads from birth to death. This does not hold for physics. We have social time, the time how we construct and coordinate, how we live together, how we say an epoch has ended, a new epoch has begun. All this is social time and the way how we construct social time. So, and now we have, in addition to that, digital time. And this experience of this additional dimension that comes with AI has some interesting bearings on the way how we divide past, present, and future. Now, of course, in our human experience, there's always, and we can distinguish, this is past, this is present, this is future. But the way how societies do this has differed enormously. In the Middle Ages, in Europe, for instance, people believed in the life after death. So the future meant essentially you either went to hell or to heaven. And in every culture, you had different collective imaginaries, what the future would be like, and you separated it from the present. If you go to Africa, people don't say the future is in front of me. They say the past is in front of me because I see what has happened. The future is behind me. So these are different cultural ways how, I'm sorry, how how we divide our orientation. Now, what is happening now, and this is a very interesting aspect in my view of digitalization. It allows us to bring much of the past into the present. We can see pictures now from the universe, which is millions of light years past, because we don't see it now. We see what happened way, way back beyond our possibility to imagine what light year means, let alone thousands or millions of light. And yet we experience it as though it happens now. When you see these gorgeous photographs, you take them into the present. And something similar happens in paleogenomics. We are told almost every day or every month about new findings that elucidate the very complex history of human developments, new species, subspecies, how we were all related. And this means the past is brought into the present. And something similar happens to the future. The future has arrived, as William Gibson said so nicely, it's only unequally distributed. Next slide. So this means both the past and the future invade our present. Future, part of it is invisible, as Anthony emphasized, you know, much of the digital infrastructures we don't see. It's embedded in digital devices, it's there in the algorithm, but it is already with us, invading the present. The past is invading the present. And so the present and our experience of the present gets condensed, gets compressed. And this very often leads to informational, but also informational, not informal, sorry, and emotional overload of the present. And this is, in my view, one of the reasons why we see this rise in identity anxieties. You know, who am I? Anthony spoke about the tsunami. It's another, you know, tsunami coming from the temporal perspective, from both past and from present, and people are becoming very anxious. You know, who am I? What is it doing to me? How can I maintain and keep something that I feel is me in all this past and future and images and connections and networks and like buttons that fill our days? And the future and the anxiety we have about the future, this is of course exacerbated by the sustainability crisis. And many young people have something like a future anxiety that is related to what will happen to the environment and to the earth on which we live. Next slide, please. So, add to this the fact that predictive algorithms become embedded in much of our institutions, in business, and we embed them also and make them part of ourselves. In institutions, already in the US, the judiciary, the police system starts to rely on predictive algorithm in wanting to sort out who is likely to benefit from bail or who is likely to go back to prison anyway, so you don't let them out to begin with. In the health system, we rely on risk factors that people again start to believe it's a risk factor. It comes with the probability, but people start to become convinced, well, you know, unless I change my lifestyle, I will fall ill, which is a good thing. But then if you start to believe in it too much, people start to worry, etc. In business, it's cheaper, it's more efficient if you automate also decision-making. And as we know from our personal experience, self-tracking also means self-domestication, because you deliver yourself to a system. Next slide, please. So this may have some worrying features, but it also has some positive features. The question is, how are we going to deal with what I call the pathologies of AI? And I call them pathologies because this means a pathology is something you can identify, you can do something against it. We know about the errors, the bias, facial recognition, the bias that AI facial recognition is much worse, for instance, for Black people. In the US, we know that the bias that is there in data is carried further into the predictions that are made. We know about fake news, conspiracy theories, the speed with which they circulate. We know all this. We also know that AI may constitute a danger to liberal democracies because of the circulation of fake news, and no one is able to control, it seems. But also for many people, this is what I call the lure of the Leviathan, you know, the Hobbes' Leviathan of the 17th century, where in order to end civil war, civil strife, he proposed people would give up their sovereignty to the Leviathan, who would decide for them. And for some people, this is indeed something they would prefer. Let an AI decide instead of having all these compromises in that a democracy requires. And the question is, how do we get, you know, from this controlling aspect? And the control is not a central control; it's a control in a distributed system. How can we regulate it? How can we have a governance of AI? Next slide, please. Now, the answer at this point you usually get from everyone is ethics. Let's design an ethical AI, a beneficial AI, an aligned AI that takes up and is aligned with human values, and then all the problems will be solved. Yes, ethics is necessary and is good, but ethics is not a checklist. And it's interesting that in a study that was done at ETH Zurich, people looked at the official guidelines for ethical AI in about 50 official government documents from all over the world, and about 50 documents by large firms. So you had the private and the public center. What did they think about ethical AI? And lo and behold, it turned out that there was not one single ethical principle that featured in these almost 100 documents, not one. The one that came closest to it was the principle of transparency, but it got only around 60% of mentions. And then there was no consensus what it actually means. So we do have a problem in getting a consensus on what we mean by ethical principle. There are also technical problems. Talking to the people who want to build an ethical AI, they tell me that it's much more technically demanding than they ever expected because of the intricate nature of the system, its scale, its scope, etc. Nevertheless, the quest as it should continues, and that leads me to the next slide. So if ethics is not the answer, what can we do? Of course, regulation is important. regulation must come from the state. And here we know from technology studies, the law always lags behind actual technological developments. Technology is faster than a law can ever be. If the law is too strict, regulating the technology of the day, it stifles innovation. If it's too lax, it does not help either, because technological development just continues. So we need a kind of regulation that is sufficient, flexible. We need a governance system that is so difficult because states either don't have the political power beyond their own national borders, or they don't have the political will to regulate an industry that is very powerful as well. And we see some of this being played out now in the US. So what are the solutions? So this is, I turn towards wisdom, and the anecdote I have to tell you at this point is that I attended a conference where we had working groups, and the working groups, the organizer decided, would be recognized not by you are working group 1 or A, but we got a haiku done by an AI. So this is simple for an AI to write a haiku, but I was not happy with my haiku. So on the way back in the plane, I decided in a very amateurish way to write a haiku myself. And I know there are the very simple haikus and very sophisticated haikus. So mine was a very simple one. But the last line of this haiku was, "Future needs wisdom." And this line stuck in my mind. So I thought, what can it mean? How can we embed wisdom into our institutions? And this means to get away from believing the AI knows us better than ourselves, of seeing the AI is how it is being built, by whom, even if we don't know the intricacies. It's a black box, but we know where the black box is being built. And to take away some of this mystifying power that we grant to the AI, and therefore to cultivate context sensitivity. As social scientists, context matters. And to develop a context sensitivity means to be critical. Where do you apply it? What are the circumstances? What is the local community or the social group to which you apply it now? And there is not one size and one prediction that fits all, but you have to get into the social context and develop a sensitivity. So we can also speak about metaphors, and at one point I spoke about looking at AI as like children. I mean, after all, we created them, but we also have the obligation to educate them, and educate them for a society like we educate children, in order to be able to make a useful contribution to society. So we should educate AI. But then, of course, people associate all kinds of things with children, or say, well, but is it not more like taming animals, etc. So metaphors might help, but they might also mislead. And finally, there are people who say AI is still in a very early stage, just like alchemy was. Newton also practiced alchemy in his time. And then, the basis of chemistry as we know it, modern chemistry, was alchemy. So maybe we are there and we will develop into a much more solid science. Maybe, but in order to do so, we need wisdom. So I come to the end, last slide. So I would like to leave some concluding thoughts with you. One message that is very important for me is to keep the horizon of the future open. I mentioned that this is one of the greatest social invention of humanity, not to think we live in a predetermined world, but the future is open. We can shape it, not completely. This would be presumptuous and would be hubris, but we can shape it to a certain extent. And so the warning, no return to a deterministic worldview that we have left behind. The future is open and the future remains uncertain, but it is full of possibilities. And this is where culture, science and technology, but also the social sciences come in, because the social sciences can always ask the question, can it be otherwise? The social sciences, from the way how they came into existence, the way how they developed, have started to question the naturalization, taking for natural something that is actually made by humans. And so cultural evolution, science and technology has overtaken biological evolution in speed, in scope, in reach. But culture also means we have the possibility of shaping what we do. And in the end, of course, the question that is the ultimate question is, what does it mean to be human on this co-evolutionary journey between the machines and us that we are now engaged in? Thank you very much for listening. I apologize for my voice. And I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you very much for your very impressive lecture, Professor Nowotny. I'm really sorry, but the time has scheduled time has passed, so we are in the additional time. So we only accept 1 or 2 questions remain. So Sei-san, please.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I got some question actually, although I'm doing some HCI human-computer interaction studies, but I'm kind of pessimistic about our future actually. For example, in the past, it's hard to imagine how North Korean guys can build nuclear weapons. So with this high tech developed for those even somehow amateur scientists. So although with those advanced technology, our society become more robust to those potential risks. But on the other hand, for those, I see psycho or insane guys, they can also be empowered. So I think, like you, social scientist mentioned in those slides, I think you are you can neutralize this craziness of our mad scientists to help us.
Look, thank you very much. But I want to counter your pessimism, because I can assure you the overwhelming majority of scientists are not mad scientists. They know very well about the potential they have in their hands, and they are committed to use it for the benefits of humankind. And of course, there always may be some rogue states, rogue people, etc. But when I mention this cultural evolution, natural evolution tinkers, tries out by trial and error. We know species went extinct, but we have the possibility to learn from our experience. And culture consists in learning. Culture consists in forming alliances between people who we think should bring together their creativity to make this world a better place.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So Ms. Setoguchi's question is should be the last question. So please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Hi, I'm Yu Setoguchi. Can you hear me? Okay. And thank you very much for your presentation. It was very interesting. And you said people believe the AI's prediction and people follow it. This is a problem. We lost our agency, as you said. And I agree with you. And I thought the why people believe the AI is not only the reason of high-tech or technology. I think that's reason for our society, like world changes rapidly in these days, and the economic gap is more and more increasing. That's why people want to know the future, and people are anxious about the future. So, and you said the ancient people also wanted to know their future like us. So what is the big difference between ancient and present, not only technology, but also society or human? I would like to listen your opinion.
Yeah, well, I said the difference is that for people who practice divination, they were convinced, like most of humanity in most of our history, that the future is predetermined. Yeah, the god or gods or destiny, the higher powers have set our future. That's the big difference. And we know this is not the case. You know, our future, to some extent, with the resources we have, with the environment in which we live, we also have the possibility of shaping our future. So this is the big difference. But I would agree with you that people start to believe the predictions because they seem objective, they seem scientific and objective. It's something rather abstract, how it's being produced. And you install it now in decision-making, in institutions, in businesses, in other kinds of circumstances, without realizing it is only an algorithm based on a prediction that extrapolates from the past, and it always comes with a probability. It's not certain. It brings a healthy dose of uncertainty with it. And this healthy dose of uncertainty, we have to, you know, inject into our way of dealing with AI.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So unfortunately, I have to close this very interesting seminar. I'd like to appreciate Professor Elliott and Professor Nowotny again to giving us such wonderful and exciting lectures. And I appreciate you, all of you, all your audiences to join and gave us interesting questions and comments. So yes, it's time to say goodbye. So have a nice day and see you next time. Bye.
Yeah, well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Goodbye, Tokyo, and goodbye, Vienna. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I hope one day we will be able to meet in this super global world.
Absolutely.
Yes. Thank you very much.